'Twas the night before Christmas, and all was quiet on the front. The soldiers were ready if the other side pulled a stunt. Then they heard the other side shout, and when they looked, they saw a lone soldier standing about. His body was shaken and covered with snow. Why the hell I'm starting the intro like this? I don't bloody know. In all seriousness, why the hell do people start movies and videos like this? It's so stupid. And it's really hard to rhyme. World War I was known for the famous Christmas truce, where troops all across the Western Front put down their guns and celebrated Christmas together before returning to war. Except for the Canadians. We had an absolute field day. We killed so many Germans that day, they did not stand a chance. You know, it's crazy how different just 4 to 5 generations can be from each other. Sorry about that, guys. Just felt a little bit of patriotism for the first time in a long time. But in all seriousness, the Christmas truce was a beautiful event in history that has inspired many alternate history scenarios about World War I ending with the Christmas truce, which honestly kind of shocks me to an extent that it didn't happen, because how the hell did they just go back to fighting each other after sharing so many beautiful memories with each other? Anyways, I would probably make that scenario one day because I have my own takes on that, but right now, I want to give World War II some love. Unlike World War I, there weren't really any widespread Christmas truces. There were a few documented small local ceasefires here and there, but nothing compared to the Christmas truce during World War I. Since World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945, that means there were 6 Christmases during World War II. The first 2 years we can't really use for points of divergences because in 1939, the Kanye West Germans already conquered Poland and hadn't started their offensive against France yet. And by 1940, they already conquered France and also didn't have any large offensives. Last of all, fast forward to Christmas of 1944, and by this point, Germany has almost capitulated and the post-war division plans were already drawn up. So it would basically be a repeat of our timeline, but with World War II ending a few months earlier than in our timeline. This leaves Christmas of 1941, 1942, and 1943 as viable for our scenario. But if the Christmas miracle would have happened in any of these years, then the scenario would play out mostly the same, with a few minor changes in each one. So, for the sake of the scenario, we're only going to cover the Christmas of 1941. So by this point in World War II, Operation Barbarossa has lasted for about 6 months. During this point in the war, it was extremely tense between the Germans and the Soviets because the Germans were as close to Moscow as they would ever get during the war, with some units as close as 24 to 32 kilometers away from the capital. By this point, the winters in the Eastern Front were some of the coldest winters ever experienced during the 20th century because climate change wasn't a thing. Obviously, sometimes cold snaps would happen that would drop below negative 40 degrees Celsius. In this scenario, a miracle happens. One of the cold snaps that drops the weather to negative 40 degrees happens a little bit before Christmas. Out of necessity, like in our timeline at points in the winter, fighting would stop because it was impossible for soldiers to fight with the equipment they had, which couldn't operate during those extremely harsh conditions. The difference in this timeline is that the cold snap doesn't pass within a day or two. It lasts for much longer across the front. During this time, soldiers would light candles and foxholes out of desperation for warmth, until eventually, when things would get really bad, the soldiers would do the Christmas truce with each other a little bit before Christmas and start crossing sides out of desperation to help each other get through this cold period. The situation is extremely grim. Medics help soldiers with frostbite, soldiers exchange rations, and they bury their dead together. This truce continues on until Christmas, as the cold doesn't give up and it's still impossible to fight. By this point, Soviets and Germans together start to abandon their posts to find any shelter nearby. When they find shelter, locals provide the soldiers with food and water, and they are all able to celebrate Christmas together in harmony. In places where there's no shelter nearby, they build their own makeshift shelters if they have wood nearby to do so to keep warmth. Eventually, Christmas passes, and by the time the New Year comes, the cold finally dies down, but by this point, a lot of the Germans are done fighting. Many posts are abandoned, and morale for the war has completely vanished. The Germans become aware that the war will last for years, and they will not be able to win it because of the endless Soviet manpower they have compared to the Germans, combined with the rest of the allies that are in the war, and especially America's entry, which would have happened not even 3 weeks before Christmas. They would also learn about some of the atrocities that their country has committed throughout the war, which will lead to many Germans having a change of heart towards the cause they are fighting for. When commanders started to order their troops to attack the other side after Christmas, the troops on both sides refused to do so. Some of the troops that left to find a shelter would have returned to their posts, since the cold has died down a bit, but they would refuse to fight each other, while other troops refused to go back to their respective sides again. Eventually, the Germans that have gone back to their posts would start to officially surrender en masse to the Soviets until the entire front collapses. Stalin, to ensure that the Germans don't stop surrendering, ensure that they are processed but aren't put into gulags like all the other Germans were. Within a few weeks, the entire front dissolves, and Communist idol loses all influence and power. With this mass surrender, the Germans lose all faith in the Third Reich, and eventually, a military coup happens and the military dictatorship that would take over Germany would officially exit the war on behalf of Germany. I'm sorry for the quick interruption, but by far, most of you guys are not subscribed, which you definitely should do because this channel is the most underrated alternate history channel on YouTube, and I have many amazing things planned for the channel which I cannot do without the support from the community. So please show your support. We're also trying to get to 500 subscribers by the new year, so your subscription will also help me achieve that goal as well. If you're already subscribed, then please binge all my videos, as I've got an increasingly large catalog of videos for you to watch, and it also helps promote my channel in the algorithm. Without further ado, let's get back into the scenario. In the peace treaty, it is mutually agreed that Germany should not get direct influence over any other country that they took over during the war, and they would be demilitarized and forced to be a neutral country, like Austria is today. The Germans would also lose all the land they have gotten except for Austria, because they did rebel against Communist favorite regime after all, and the majority did want to become part of Germany, and it wouldn't really negatively affect any other countries, like if the Germans would have annexed any other German territories that were part of other countries, like the Sudeten land that was part of Czechoslovakia. The Soviets would keep the land they partitioned between themselves and the Germans at the beginning of the war, and Poland wouldn't gain the Russian Germanic territories that they gained in our timeline, and they wouldn't get their eastern territories back that they gained in the Polish-Soviet War in our timeline. And along with that, they would also lose the free city of Danzig and the Polish corridor, but they would get leases and ports within Germany to get some access to the Baltic Sea, while also getting some of the Polish parts of East Prussia as compensation. From here, all the Eastern European countries will go back to having the same borders as they did after World War II in our timeline, except for Czechoslovakia, who would keep Carpathia, Bithynia, since the Soviets wouldn't have occupied them in this timeline. Which leads me to one last note, which is that the coup in Germany would have happened before the Soviets were able to really push into any of the Eastern European territories. Therefore, unlike in our timeline, they wouldn't be able to puppet them like they were in our timeline, since they liberated those territories manually during the ending stages of World War II. What the Soviets would have is soft power all across Europe, because they would be seen as the people who showed the Communist Germans the error of their ways during the Christmas truce, which ended the war, which would be a huge propaganda win for them, which the Soviets would use to expand the popularity of communism, which will come into play during the post-war world. Despite the war ending in Europe, World War II isn't over yet, because the continuation war would still be going on, and America and the Soviets would still be at war with Japan. For the continuation war, it would most likely end soon after Germany surrenders, because Finland would want it to end because they wouldn't have Germany as an ally to fight against the Soviets, and the Soviets would most likely want to end the war because they wouldn't want to fight in any more wars, and would want to focus on post-World War II Europe instead. In that peace treaty, the borders that were changed after the Winter War would be recognized, and Finland would be forced to potentially limit its army size and become a neutral country like Germany would be now. Over to the Pacific, and with no war in Europe, America will fully commit to the war against the Japanese and send troops to fight against Japan instead of fighting against Germany, which will lead to Operation Downfall happening in this timeline, since the nuclear bomb wouldn't have been invented yet. The Soviets will let the Americans and the British do all the heavy lifting in their island hopping campaign, while the Soviets will focus their attention on fighting in the war by using the Chinese communists as proxies, while also eventually leading to them invading Manchuria, Korea, and northern Japan over time. Eventually, one way or another, the war ends, and in the peace treaty in this timeline, everything would be the same, except all of Korea would be under communism, and Japan would be divided as was initially planned in the Operation Downfall Occupation Plan. And with that, this alternate World War II is officially over, with less casualties in Europe and way more casualties in the Pacific. Post-war, the American and British occupation zone would eventually be unified like what happened in Germany in our timeline, and after the war, Britain wouldn't be nearly as devastated as they were in our timeline because they only would have been at war with Germany for a few years, so the Battle of Britain wouldn't have lasted nearly as long as it did in our timeline, so their empire wouldn't collapse as fast as it did in our timeline. But the war against Japan and the war they did fight against Germany in this timeline, combined with World War I and the Great Depression, would still take too much of a toll on the British Empire, and they would collapse like they did in our timeline. The difference in this timeline, however, is that over time, decolonization would be a bit slower and more negotiated since the British will still be in a better state than they were in our timeline, but their collapse would still be inevitable. Since America never fought in Europe, they wouldn't have all the influence they got in our timeline in Western Europe, which would instead be replaced by Soviet soft power. The Soviets could help rebuild all of Europe instead of only half of Europe, and then over time, use communist support in countries across Europe to start civil wars, coups, and parliamentary wins to cement their sphere of influence across Europe. Now, communist support across Europe would be vastly different because the harshness of World War II in all of Europe did promote radicalization for communist support, so it could theoretically have the opposite effect, and the Europeans would be less sympathetic to communism than in our timeline. If the Europeans are less radicalized, then they would most likely band together to help prevent the Soviets from expanding communism, leading to a similar situation in modern-day Europe, where all of Europe has banded together to help prevent Russia from expanding. Alternatively, if the Soviets' victory against the Germans has the opposite effect, and the Europeans support communism even more than in our timeline, then we could very likely see all these countries that had large communist movements in our timeline go red, like what I was talking about earlier. This would likely be the first true spark to the alternate Cold War, which would be vastly different than in our timeline, because the Iron Curtain that has descended upon Europe in our timeline wouldn't really exist in this timeline. The only major difference I would see happening is the potential unification between Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, which was heavily supported by Stalin, but didn't happen due to disagreements with Tito. But in this timeline, assuming Stalin gains control over both countries, then they would be unified to create one pan-Slavic union. Other than that, there's not much else to discuss other than Germany, who would be neutral in this timeline and would most likely democratize and not go down the communist path since they wouldn't want to be under another dictatorship. Yugoslavia also most likely won't collapse like they did in our timeline after Tito died, since Tito's death played a big role in why Yugoslavia collapsed in our timeline. Other than that, it's just a regular Cold War like in our timeline, but more tense in Japan than in Germany, and the Soviets would control different parts of Europe than they did in our timeline. One situation happens here, another thing happens there, but at the end of the day, it's still communism, and just like in our timeline, it will inevitably fail, and the Soviet Union will collapse along with all their influence in Europe, and it will most likely resemble Europe today, but with a few different changes and different governments. Japan would also most likely be reunified like Germany was after the Cold War, except for maybe China's sphere of influence and the parts that the Soviet Union annexed, which would be a part of modern-day Russia. And other than that and all those minor border changes, the world is mostly the same as it was in our timeline, but with a way less devastating World War II, and the legacy of the Christmas truce that is a true testimony to the humanity of mankind, and I think that is the perfect note to end this scenario on. Thank you all for watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and turn on notifications to be notified on any future videos. And until next time, don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot, and I'll see you all next time.